purpose of this Socrative quiz is just to give you practice at applying what we talked about last week in terms of understanding whether or not organisms asexually reproduce. If you can predict that they asexually reproduce by parthenogenesis, by cloning, fission, etc. So if you just joined us, feel free to sign in and work along with us as we go through the answers to this quiz. So we've got 5 different parents and their genotypes shown up here. So we can just focus on the numbers, the 7s, 5s, 4s, 6s. This first question was asking about, and all of these questions that are in this quiz are identical other than that term right there that I circled in red. I'm just asking, with those parent genotypes, A through E, and the kid genotypes, presumably kids, which of those kids would be reproduced by, or would be products of sexual reproduction? So in this case, there was some mixed answers in class about which of those 3 different genotypes, F, G, or H, could have come through sexual reproduction. Are any of those genotypes not able to be produced by fusion of sperm and egg that came from these parents? So how would you produce, for those of you that said yes, how would you produce genotype G from the parents? Yeah, so you could have a sperm that was produced by, if individual A was a male, for example, and if individual B was a female, that could be a sperm, and that could be an oocyte. So you could produce a 7/7, a homozygote, from sexual reproduction using those parents. Which of those 3, F, G, and H, could only be produced by sexual reproduction? So F is the only individual here where you had to get a 6 and a 5 necessarily from 2 different individuals in the parents. So all 3 of those genotypes could be produced by sexual reproduction. Only one of them, which I didn't ask, but I just did, only one of them has to have been produced by sexual reproduction. The only one that has a genotype not found in the parents. Right? That's the essence of sexual reproduction. You find genotypes that aren't found in the parentals. Any questions about this? Okay, so if we move on to the subsequent question, same genotypes, just different mode of reproduction. In this case, we're talking about asexual reproduction, specifically if these individuals A through E are self-fertile hermaphrodites, which of the kids or offspring could be produced by selfing? So if G reproduces by selfing, who is that individual's parent? So selfing, a form of asexual reproduction where you have sperm and egg meet, yes, but they're both produced by the same parent. So it's a single parent, and that's why it's asexual reproduction. It's not 2 parents, 2 gametes, 1 parent, 2 gametes. You're looking for the individual that has the exact same genotype. Where are you? So could either of the other 2, could F or H be produced by sexual reproduction, or by asexual reproduction? Who would H's parent be in that case? Yeah, so this individual has a 4 allele and a 7 allele, and so does parent E. So it's possible that parent E could have produced, in spermatogenesis, a sperm that, say, had allele 4 and an oocyte that had allele 7. And by syngamy, the fusion of those 2 gametes, you could produce an offspring that is heterozygous like the parent was. So in this case, both G and H could have been produced by self-fertile hermaphrodites. So in sexual reproduction, you expect to see potentially new combinations of gametes that aren't found in any single individual. In selfing, all of the offspring have to have one of the same combinations of alleles that one of the parents has. So what rule are we going to see if we look at patterns that tell us that fission is how reproduction is occurring? Like bacteria, say. Cell divides, budding. This could also be something like paratomic fission in the neodine annelids. So if it's clonal, then yeah, the genotype of the offspring should be exactly the same as the parent. So which one of the offspring is that in this case? So here, G, again, right? G's genotype is the same as parent A, just like the last question. What about F? Right, there are no 6 5s up here. So that individual wouldn't be produced by fission. What about H?
Yeah. E.
Again, parent E could produce individual H by fission. So we're looking for, in fission, identical genotypes, parent to offspring. It's cloning. Everybody should have the same genotype. Okay. So lastly then, what about parthenogenesis? It looked like most of you actually got this right, which I was surprised only because this is the most difficult, I think, pattern to look for. But you obviously understand what the pattern is. So F, G, or H, which of those could be produced by parthenogenesis? Who's been jumping on the ceiling? So what's going to be true about parthenogenesis?
Similar to the parent because only one parent produces.
Okay, so it's going to be similar to the parent because only one parent produces the gametes. What's true about the two gametes that fuse, the two cells, one oocyte and one second polar body? What's true about their haplotypes, genotypes?
They're the same.
Right, they're identical. So let's say you had an individual like parent E here. There was a 4-7 heterozygote. After synthesis, right, start of meiosis, you're going to have 2 copies of allele 4 and 2 copies of allele 7, 4 pieces of DNA in this cell that we're interested in. What does this look like after the first division? How do those 4 alleles segregate in first division of meiosis?
You have the first polar body, which would be either 7-7 or 4-4. And then you have an oocyte that would go on to divide 7.
Right, so it's the 2 identical alleles stay together during the first division. Yes?
Okay, so I remembered with the snakes and parthenogenesis, didn't it say that males and females could be produced, or was it only males?
So you could produce individuals of either sex through parthenogenesis in snakes.
Yeah.
Yep.
But then,
So we're not, go ahead, but we're not talking about sex chromosomes necessarily here.
okay, but like if the same ones always stay together though, then wouldn't it only produce males in the case of those snakes?
Good question. So a detailed issue here. If the 2 alleles, the 4s and the 7s, go together during the first division of meiosis, how could you ever get an oocyte that has either a 4 or a 7? Well, which of these 2 cells after the first division is going to go on to produce the oocyte? Either, exactly. So we don't know yet which of these. That cell might divide to produce the oocyte, or that one might, and that choice is random. So if we were looking at Z and W chromosomes here, then half of the time the oocyte would carry a Z, and the other half of the time the oocyte would carry a W, and that's how you would get two different sexes produced. So let's assume, for the sake of this, that the top cell is the one that's going to divide and produce an oocyte and a polar body. Okay, these are the two cells that fuse together at parthenogenesis to produce the offspring. So what's going to be true about the offspring's genotype? They're always going to be homozygous, because the second polar body and the oocyte always have the same allele in them because of how cell division at meiosis works. So you'll never see a heterozygote produced, because that would mean that after the second division, these two polar bodies that carry the 7s are not the ones that fuse with the oocyte during, as far as we know, during parthenogenesis. You expect the second polar body right there and the oocyte to fuse to form the parthenogenic offspring. So in that case, the only offspring that's homozygous is this 7/7 individual G. All the other two options are heterozygotes, and that wouldn't occur as a process after the process of parthenogenesis. Yeah.
So then, so normally the system, like if we're looking at sex chromosomes, would be ZZ and ZW though, but wouldn't that mean that a WW could end up being an option, or
Yes.
does that actually produce a viable offspring?
So the question here is, in a ZW system, where the females are the ones that have two sex chromosomes, so this is a female, we have a cell that's got one Z chromosome and one W chromosome. So after the first cell division, you get two cells that are diploid. Didn't draw synthesis here. So synthesis occurs here, then the first division. So you can either get, after the second division, say an oocyte and a second polar body that's a Z, and that produces a ZZ individual, which in this system is what sex? Male. Embryo. Or if it was the WW cell that went through the second division to produce the oocyte and a polar body, then what's a WW organism? That's the question. So it should be male. It doesn't have a Z chromosome, but that's basically the same thing as asking, is a YY human a male, and are they viable? Or is there such thing as a YY human male? No X chromosome.
I think YYs are inviable.
Right. And the same is probably true for this, that WWs are probably inviable. So perhaps I do have to retract, I'll think about it more, but I might have to retract what I said several classes ago when we were discussing the same topic. With this in mind, if it's always the second polar body that fuses to the oocyte, there's no way, even in snakes, lizards, birds, to produce males as a result of parthenogenesis. But wouldn't that make sense? We didn't really talk about this, but why is parthenogenesis useful?
In the ZW system, it could replenish more males into the system if they had to perform parthenogenesis because there were no males around.
Right. So parthenogenesis, in other words, if you didn't hear what she said, parthenogenesis is like most self-fertile hermaphrodites as well. The benefit is you don't have to find a mate. And what's happened in these cases I've talked about in class, the snake that reproduced without having a mate, the shark that reproduced without having a mate, the striking feature is that it's usually in the absence of a mate that parthenogenesis occurs. That is, when you would expect it would actually be evolutionarily beneficial to be parthenogenic. And it's thought that that's one of the reasons that allows parthenogenesis, essentially, is when there are very few individuals of the opposite sex around, then parthenogenesis is somehow stimulated. Yeah.
The product, is it a male or a female? Is it always female or could it be male?
So in this case, we've decided that the products are always ZZ, which are males. And in the case of XY sex chromosome systems, it would be always females.
So it could be either or?
Depends on the species you're looking at. Yep. So if the species has ZZ, which is male, and ZW sex chromosomes, which are female, parthenogenesis would, as we drew on this slide, produce, you would expect, would only produce ZZ offspring, or WW, which we've concluded are likely inviable. And if you have an XX, XY system, like in humans, where the XXs are the females and the XYs are the males, then you'd produce W. You'd produce XX or YY as a result of parthenogenesis. But again, I know for sure that if you don't have an X chromosome, you're inviable. So the WW is likely the same in the ZW, ZZ systems. So you produce males if you're a ZZ sex chromosome species, or you produce females if you're an XXXY sex chromosome species. So is it beneficial or not to be parthenogenic? You get to reproduce without a mate, so your fitness goes up. But what happens in the next generation? So variation goes down because what did we say about all the parthenogenically reproduced offspring?
Exactly similar to the parent.
They're all homozygous anyway. Yeah, they're all going to be identical to the parent. They're all going to have a homozygous genotype. So there's no heterozygosity, no genetic variation at all in that individual. What about on the population scale? If you have one shark that's plopped into an aquarium and she parthenogenically reproduces, what happens to her lineage in the next generation?
It's seasons, because she's only produced
Yeah, exactly. So she's only producing one sex of offspring. So her lineage goes extinct because there's no chance for reproduction in the next generation. So you might consider if I'm saying anything at all. I know I've been watching Iron Man a lot recently, so if I'm saying anything at all, it is this, that while parthenogenesis seems like a benefit immediately, it doesn't necessarily have a long-term benefit. So yeah, you get to reproduce. The fitness of the individual who parthenogenically reproduces is non-zero. They've made some offspring. Whether or not their offspring go ahead and pass on their genomes depends on whether or not some members of the opposite sex also happen to be encountered by those offspring. So if this shark mom only produced male offspring, say, then they'd better hope that they find a female to reproduce with. Because, well, first, males can't parthenogenically reproduce. And second, even if they could, they can't. If they have to find a female mate to mate with. So once the sex ratio in your population goes to 100% males or 100% females, if you're a sexual reproducer, game's up. Everyone goes extinct.
But if they looking parthenogenesis and keep creating females, will they keep going? Will they just keep creating more females? Parthenogenesis.
But yeah, exactly. So if you're a species that only produces
Variation goes
females,
down, but your species can continue on just through parthenogenesis.
yes, in an XX system, that could occur.
Technically can't keep going.
Right,
have no
you could-
variation whatsoever, population
Right.
won't move one side or the other, but the population will continue.
Right. So in XXXY systems, females keep getting produced and they could keep parthenogenically reproducing.
But even with the shark example you gave, couldn't the parents reproduce with the offspring, assuming
Absolutely. So if we decide to invoke parent-child mating, then there's a possibility for that sort of mating, which is as detrimental as parthenogenesis because it's inbreeding. So it has the same genetic effect. Whether or not siblings are mating with each other, whether or not you are selfing, or whether or not you're having parent-child mating, yeah, it does allow for production of more offspring. Everybody's having very deep and accurate thoughts about parthenogenesis, which I appreciate. It's clear you've been thinking a lot. So at the end of last class, I closed with this slide, which was just making the point that, and this is a cartoon representing real data, but this is a cartoon, representing a trend that exists in evolution and in biology in general, which is that when we see asexual taxa show up on the tree of life, they tend not to produce multiple species. So asexuality evolves and then it goes extinct. Asexuality is never around long enough. In other words, we never see trends where there's a whole group of organisms that are asexual, which would mean that asexuality evolved up here, and then it lasted long enough through time that multiple species had been created. So asexuality, in other words, is never old. When a species evolves asexuality, it doesn't last. That suggests there's something bad about being asexual. That it's not, maybe it's short-term beneficial, like we just discussed. Maybe on the short term it's useful, but when you look at it over the long term, when natural selection looks at it over the long term, clearly there's something that's ultimately net detriment. There's a cost to being asexual.
Kind of like bottlenecking, if you think about it. It decreases your gene pool so rapidly.
Right. So it's a form of bottlenecking. It's a reduced population size. We've seen what reduced population size is using red links. We saw what reduced population sizes does to genetic diversity. Small population size, allele variation goes either to 100% or 0% rapidly. And I just want to bring back this concept of species concepts really quickly. So, when I talk about species on this tree, does it matter which sort of species concept I'm using when I draw this sort of a cartoon? Biological species concept versus recognition species concept. What species concept would be useful to talk about asexual taxa? Could this be the biological species concept?
Where it's large and movable. Is that what it's? That would be biological, right?
So which one was the biological species concept? How do you test whether or not two individuals are members of the same biological species? Yeah, if they're able to mate together.
Asexually reproduced.
So what if you're one of these neotine annelids that reproduce by paratomic fission? You grow two individuals in the middle of, you grow a posterior on the anterior half of your body and the anterior on the posterior half of your body, you split in two. How would you know if there were 2 or more species of that type of worm? Biological species concept's probably not very useful when you're talking about a species that reproduces by fission. So what sort of species concept would we want to use instead?
Recognition?
So recognition, do 2 members of the same species recognize each other as 2 members of the same species? Phylogenetic. So that has to do with how similar they look or act or something about the traits or characters of the 2 species, or the 2 individuals rather. So that would work. You could measure a bunch of features about the worms, the annelids. Okay, that would be fine. How would you know when there were 2 different species?
You'd have to know.
But they don't mate. So that's the problem. I'm wondering if this sort of analysis, as a bottom line, I wonder if this sort of analysis is biased. Because when you have an asexual taxa, how do you tell whether or not there are multiple species?
Genetic relatedness?
Genetic relatedness. If you're asexually reproducing, like my C. Briggsii across the street in my lab, if you've got a self-fertile hermaphrodite, it doesn't have to mate, and you're just looking at genetic relatedness, how do you define how genetically related you have to be 2 different species? You remember one of the problems with the phylogenetic species concept is that if you have a single genetic difference between 2 individuals, like brother and sister, or sister and sister, from a same self-fertile hermaphrodite, if there's a mutation that distinguishes them, they could be considered 2 different species. There's a diagnostic genetic difference between them. In other words, one of these branches of an asexual taxa might actually look like this, where every individual is its own species, because every individual is genetically distinct. I'm just trying to refresh your memory on some concepts we talked about in phylogenetics, which was quite a long time ago, but since we're starting to approach the end of the semester, I'm going to try to start bringing some of these concepts back into class. Go back and review these concepts. All right. So today in next class, the fun part is talking about costs and benefits of sex. Hopefully it's the benefits and not so much the costs that's fun. So today we're going to talk about costs. That's the first section in the chapter, 16.2. Next time we'll talk about benefits. So what do you think? We've already covered a few different costs and benefits of sexual reproduction. Some of you have mentioned them multiple times when we've been talking about this. So let's make a list. And I'll go through a few examples of ones that we come up with. So what's a benefit of sexual reproduction? Genetic variation. So you get genes from mom, genes from dad coming together in new combinations for the very first time on the planet to produce genetically unique offspring. Others. Costs, benefits.
Cost, you have to find a mate.
Cost, yeah. Something that many of us are very lucky happened. You have to find a mate. Why is that costly? Time. So you have to take time away from your studies to go to the bar. What else? Sorry? No? Comment in the back, no? So yeah, you have to spend money buying people drinks. Let's see. Right, yeah, it's resources. Energy, some sort of resource. Depends on which species and what sort of resources you need to attract a mate. Okay. What else? Costs, benefits. Pardon? Yeah, time, right. So time, resources, money, energy.
You're leaving it up to chance. Like, it's not a guarantee, even if you spend the time.
still, yeah, so you're still not guaranteed to reproduce if you're sexual reproducing, even if you put all these resources into finding a mate. What about mortality?
An increase in mortality. When you're looking for a mate, you're not focused on whether or not you're being made one.
Okay, so, yeah. That's a big one. Think about peacocks. The huge flashy tail, the big sign to a predator, hey, lunch is over there. But that's what the male has to do to try to find a mate. Yeah.
About competition, you have to compete with other males.
Right, so competition.
We're finding a lot of costs.
Yeah, the scale sort of tipped towards why the hell do we sexually reproduce?
Which is strange because it seems like there's more cost than benefits, so why are there more sexual organisms?
I think the benefit is so large.
Yeah.
I think the benefit just completely outweighs all the
Yeah.
costs. Yeah, exactly. There you go.
Yeah.
That dude.
Yeah.
With a capital G, yeah.
There you go.
Are there other benefits? So we're going to talk about costs today. We'll talk about benefits next. Is that so
Seems like
maternal
cost.
care, is that a cost or a benefit?
That seems like a cost.
We both.
I don't know.
I suppose it depends on the perspective, if it's the parent or the child.
Yeah, it depends on perspective. We're talking about from the perspective of the kid or the perspective of the parent. So I'm not sure which column to put that in.
Also depends on whether there are S-type species.
I mean, you know, some eat the mom.
Oh dear. Yeah, and then we have, right. Well, and then there are some moms who feed their skin to their kid,
Yeah.
right? What is that, Sicilian lizards, I think, that do parental skin feeding? Oh, go ahead.
Increase.
Yeah, go for it. I'll try to find that paper and maybe I'll show you next time. Okay, so one cost of sex has to do with energetics. This is sort of classic evolutionary theory. The twofold cost of sex basically says that in the same amount of time with the same number of resources, if you're an asexually reproducing individual, you make twice as many offspring as sexually reproducing offspring. So in other words, not that we choose whether or not we're going to be sexually reproducing species. If you had the choice, choosing to be a sexually reproducing species means that you invest twice as much resource into producing one offspring. That's because you have to have two, it takes two to tango. Right? So you have to have a male and a female to produce a kid. And in our species especially, in most mammals and other species, while the female's carrying an offspring, there's no additional chance for more reproduction, at least from the mom's point of view. In a monogamous species, it's also true from the dad's point of view. Whereas if you're an asexually reproducing individual, in the same amount of time, one individual produces two kids. So if you start this drawing with two individuals, like we have on the sexual side over here, we start with two individuals, they produce two kids. If you've got two asexuals, asexually reproducing, in the same amount of time, they produce twice as many kids. So that's the twofold cost of sex. If you're asexually reproducing, you produce twice as many offspring. What does that mean in terms of evolution? Why is it beneficial to have more kids? Have higher chance of. So you've got increased fitness, but the increased fitness is because you've got more kids. So the definition of fitness is how many kids do you have that survive to reproduce?
It increased gene spread.
So benefit, so bigger population size, reduced genetic drift, that's interesting.
Do they have a larger population size because they're unable to evolve?
So I'm going to say that there can't be a larger population size. That what's happening right now, let's imagine this, that this process is happening in a closed environment. So in one little niche in nature, you've got a sexually reproducing species, and you've got an asexually reproducing species. They eat the same food, they live in the same place. What's the benefit of being asexual? So there's a limit to the total number of individuals that can live in this niche. So you don't need to find a mate, that's a benefit.
You already have more, your population has already increased, so yeah, your chances of acquiring food has increased so that
So there's something about the number of offspring you have that's important here.
You don't have to eat as much to produce more offspring.
So you don't have to eat as much to produce as many offspring. One individual produces 2 offspring instead of 2 individuals producing 2 offspring. But look at how does the balance here between the number of sexually reproducing offspring in the second generation versus the number over here in the second generation.
Will increase competition in the future.
Right, so every generation, the asexuals have more and more and more offspring. What's happening to the population size of the sexually reproducing pair? Relative to the asexuals, the sexual stays about the same. So what happens over many, many, many generations in this population of 2 different species?
To fight over the same niches.
Right, so now in the second generation, the asexually reproducing offspring are eating like 80% of the available food. In the subsequent generation, what happens? Right, the asexual group is exponentially increasing in number. So eventually what happens is the sexual species goes extinct because they can no longer produce enough offspring to successfully compete for resources. Those crazy hermaphrodites just reproduce so much, they take over and outcompete the sexually reproducing species. So that's the concept of the twofold cost of sex.
How do we know that they're not competing with each other?
They are also competing with each other, it's true. So at some point, but the evolutionary races, the goal of evolution, maybe, if there's a conscious goal, is your lineage survives. And so when you're an asexually reproducing organism, on the previous slide, all of your offspring are genetically identical. So as the matriarch of the species, you probably wouldn't care. I'm not saying you wouldn't care. If I was the matriarch of the species, I wouldn't care which of my offspring died as a result of competition with their siblings. I would just care that I've got great-great-great-great-grandchildren. Does that make sense? So everybody's genetically identical. It doesn't matter who lives and who dies. The point is, we've secured the resources from those crappy sexually reproducing species. We've staked our claim, and now our lineage proceeds longer than it would have otherwise. So you've already absolutely identified this idea that the search for mates is costly, and that's one of the major detriments of sexual reproduction. That's why these fish that live in the deep ocean, maybe you know this, like anglerfish that live down in the abyssal, the dark zone. It's so hard to find a mate down there that this is what happens. Male is that little tiny thing that's on the back of the head of the female. When a male finds a female, or vice versa, when the female finds a male of its own species, the male actually bites onto the female fish and then starts taking nutrients basically from the female. So the male basically is feeding on the female bloodstream, I guess. And that male basically becomes an appendage on the female. Like, he never lets go. He basically becomes a sexual organ. The female puts up with this because the male produces sperm. So so now it's almost essentially a hermaphrodite. One body produces both sperm and eggs. That's an elegant solution to the problem. You're physically tethered to your mate. Well, I don't know if that's elegant or not.
What does he just spit stuff into her? How does he inseminate?
So I believe these are external fertilizers as well. So the male's just there to release sperm. So it's not internal fertilization through where the male is bit onto the female. But the male is at least in close proximity, whereas if this was not the case, you might never be able to reproduce. Again, how do you find a mate when it's dark? And if you're a species that has a small population size. Right. Cologne. So this is one adaptation to the problem of one of the costs of sex. It's difficult to find a mate. We've got sexually transmitted diseases as an issue with sexual reproduction. And that's a broader issue than just with humans as well. So when you sexually reproduce, you expose yourself to all sorts of genes being passed on from a mate, and you are never really sure whether or not that mate is giving you all entirely good genes. Sometimes not. If you were a Colossobruchus analis female, you might not want to mate with the males because for whatever bizarre reason, their penis has been decorated with all these spines. So it's known that in this species, mating actually physically harms the female. Seems sort of non-ideal, doesn't it? Why would evolution come up with this sort of a genitalia? If it's harmful to the female, what's the benefit of having a spiky penis? I never thought I'd say that before.
Is it for attachment?
So you're right. So it could have something to do with the success of mating.
It depends.
It could be a weapon. It could be male-male competition. I'll have to see if I can find a video. Okay, one of the last ones, which is counter to what everybody says, because you've heard this so many classes, the idea that sex is beneficial because it creates new combinations of genes. But what people rarely think about, not evolutionary biologists, but people in general rarely think about is the idea that once you have a beneficial combination of genes, wouldn't you like to keep that combination of genes together? Instead of breaking them up in meiosis. And that's what this figure from your book represents. And I suggest that you go actually read the caption, at least, if not this part of this section. Because it's a really interesting concept. It's not always necessary to have more genetic variation. Sometimes you have that perfect combination of genes that gives you the perfect combination of traits for your environment. And then having sexual reproduction leads to producing a lot of offspring that don't have that optimal combination of genes because of recombination. Meiosis, sexual reproduction. Okay. So that's a brief overview of the cost of sex. Next time we'll do benefits. Really briefly though, just to wrap up, I'm going to start a new Socrative quiz in just about a half a minute, and it just asks you one question. I'd just like you to reflect briefly, maybe one or two sentences, that's all. Does the concept of mode of reproduction, hermaphroditism, asexuality, sexual reproduction, at all impact the topics you're writing about for your term paper? If so, give me a one sentence. Why does the mode of reproduction in the system that I'm talking about important for my term paper topic? And I'll leave this open until 10:30 or so, but you've got a couple minutes now to work on it if you like.